Okay, let's get started. Thank everyone for coming. As much as it's bad out there, I know. Like I said, we scraped as much as we could yesterday, and didn't have any ice melt. Couldn't find any, so we only didn't really look real hard. But Tom brought some salt, but it didn't help much either. It's just too cold. I don't know. I haven't seen him. So if you will, open your Bibles. We're in our second lesson. Open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1. Before we begin that, though, let's go back just a little bit into the Old Testament. It's, the last two verses of the Old Testament is Malachi 4, 5, and 6. It says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah, the prophet, before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he will return the hearts of fathers to their children, and the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction." So, if you're reading the Old Testament and you come to this section where you end and you go straight into the New Testament, you kind of, if you're just reading it to be reading it, and it's the first time you've ever read it, you kind of get thrown for some loops, don't you? Because if you read a story and you jump from one section to another, and then all of a sudden you got all new characters, all new stuff going on, it kind of throws you for a loop that you don't understand what's going on. That's what happens in between the Old Testament and New Testament. You got the Old Testament, which ends right here at the end of Malachi, and then you basically, if you have a printed Bible, you have a blank page. One page, blank page. Mine says New Testament on it, but most of them are blank pages. And then you flip over to Matthew chapter 1. And I guess and to be honest, that one page is where all the context of the New Testament lies. Where did all these new people come from? What did they do? Why are they all now speaking Greek? Why do they do what they're doing now? Who are certain people that we've never seen before? It all lies in that period. You know, and when we look at the title of our lesson, The Fullness of Time, it all lies in that one blank page. And the way you look at it, I call it the blank page. A lot of people call it the blank page. Most scholars call it the Intertestamental Period, which is basically the time between the Old Testament and the time between the New Testament. And in between that time, it's about 400 years, a little over 400 years. And of that 400 years, God doesn't speak. There are no prophets. He doesn't talk to his people. And there have been some major events that shape the culture that God's people that you read in the New Testament are living in now. For instance, Persia, who was the rulers of the world at the time that the Old Testament ends, are no longer around. And Rome and its Caesars now rule the world. You have no idea where they came from, how they got to where they were. And the Jewish nation, Israel, is no longer called Israel. It's referred to as Judea. And Judea is just a Roman adaptation of the word Judah. So it's the same thing. Israel, Judah, Judea. It's all synonyms in the New Testament. And then Judea is ruled by another king called Herod the Great. And he is basically a king that's been appointed by the Roman Empire. The high priest is now someone who's been selected by Rome, not selected by God, not chosen by birth like he's supposed to be, but selected by the Roman Empire, and his name is Caiaphas, Joseph Caiaphas. And he is the most powerful man in all of Judea except for Herod the Great. And God's people are still waiting on the Messiah. They're still waiting on him to restore the throne to David, like he promised in the Old Testament. So all these 400 years, all this stuff, all this time, he's developed this period. it goes from that. We go all the way from Israel being ruled by the Persians to, in that period, the Persians are defeated by the Greeks, by Alexander the Great. When he dies, he didn't have any heirs, and his empire is divided up into 4 sections among his generals. The 2 sections that are really important to us into the Gospels are ruled by 2 guys by the name of Seleucus and Ptolemy. And the reason I say that is because they controlled the area surrounding. In other words, they controlled that Middle Eastern area. They controlled the area surrounding Judea, including Syria and Egypt. And they had war amongst themselves for over 100 years. And Jerusalem and Judea is caught in the middle for over 100 years. So this war that goes on for over 100 years back and forth is constantly changing what's going on. But eventually the Seleucids, as they call it, went out, and they end up controlling that whole area of Syria and Judea. And in 167 BC, the Seleucid king of Syria, it's Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth. He tried, and this is very important to us in the New Testament, he tried to unite all the nations under his rule by forcing them to adapt and adopt Greek culture. That's why everybody speaks Greek. That's why there's so much Greek lore in the New Testament. That's why there's so much Greek concepts in the New Testament, because of this man. He wanted their customs, their arts, and even their language in there. That's why the New Testament is written in Greek. This is called Hellenization. And in history, this happens quite often. When you go in and you take over a country, you try to force them to be what you want them to be. This right here is actually where they actually adopt the Greek ideals, their philosophies. He even tried to force them to assimilate into their religious culture. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But the big one is he forced them to learn the Greek language and speak it. And that causes everybody in the New Testament language to be bilingual. They either spoke, whether it was Hebrew, they either spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, or their native language. If it was Rome, it was Latin. And then they also spoke Greek, which was a common language between all people. So you have everybody speaking a common language, basically, and you can communicate. They maybe had some different dialects, but it was basically the same language, and they could read all the same language. So that's a very big thing that happened in this time period that sets the stage for the Gospels. This is what has happened when Jesus is born. When you see the birth, all this stuff has happened, and it sets the stage for Jesus. Now, also under that king, he tried to force, like I said, he tried to force him to worship the Greek gods, especially Zeus. He even went so far as to rededicate the Jewish temple in Jerusalem to Zeus. And we read that this is outside the Bible, but we read that in the first Maccabees. In 154, it says, now the 15th day of the month of Seslu, in the 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar and builded idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side. This becomes what's known as the abomination of desolation in history. In other words, they start to worship false gods inside the temple of Jerusalem. God's temple is now being used at this point to worship Zeus. And this leads to what's called the Maccabean Revolt. I know you've probably heard us mention that several times. This leads to the Maccabean Revolt, and he's led by a guy by the name of Matthias. And this is not to be confused with the Matthias in Acts that we just got done studying. But that rebellion lasted all the way up to 134 BC. And eventually, Judea did free themselves from that king. And he did overthrow them and kick them out. And it took them 3 years to the day after the temple had been desecrated to clean it, to purify it, to do all the rituals before they started worshiping God again in it. And 3 years to the day, they went back in and dedicated the temple back to God. And then that established, at that point, they established a new feast called the Feast of Dedication. We know it today as Hanukkah. Hanukkah is just the Hebrew word for dedication. It's practiced from that point on, even up to modern day today. Jesus will even practice Hanukkah in the New Testament. And you can see that in John 10:22. At that time, the Feast of Dedication took place at Jerusalem it was winter. So we see all this stuff going on historically that sets the stage for Jesus. We see all this stuff going on, but we also see a lot of people come into play that wasn't in the Old Testament. We get people coming through that we have no idea who it is. They've never been mentioned in the Old Testament. For instance, we have two groups of people we've never seen before. If you were just reading through, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they are never mentioned in the Old Testament. These groups basically originated 150 years before Christ, so in this intertestamental period. What happens is they basically become the Jewish political parties. And just like today, both parties worry about themselves and not about the people that God put them over. The views are basically polar opposite, and they compete against each other for power and influence over the people. And they're mentioned frequently in the Gospels, and these religious leaders are in constant friction, one or the other, with Jesus. And both parties will feel threatened by Jesus, but for different reasons. For instance, the Pharisees, they did believe that Jesus violated the law of Moses, and they did believe that he was undermining their influence with the people. They truly believed it. The Sadducees weren't so much afraid that he was undermining the law, but they were terrified that Jesus would undermine their influence and political relationships with Rome. So you had two different parties, two different things going on. And the difference between, and you work handout, I gave you a kind of a chart, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but the difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees are laid out. The big ones are, the first one is, their name means, the Pharisees means separated one. In other words, they wanted to be separate and they wanted to be holy. And if you notice, he's the one that when Jesus critiques them and rebukes them, it's always because they're doing things that they think they're making themselves holy and separating themselves instead of helping others. And that's not really what they're supposed to be about. The Sadducees are the righteous ones. They think they are more righteous because of who they are. In other words, and they were actually believed to be the descendants of the high priest Zadok, who was the high priest of David. So they felt they were righteous simply because of their lineage. And the Sadducees were the more wealthy ones. They usually had all the power. They usually had all the money. Pharisees, not as much. Yes, they had power and stuff and influence, but not as much as the Sadducees. So you had, and the Sadducees were more involved in political maneuvering, whereas the Sadducees were more involved in religious purity, kind of like Puritans. They thought you should be perfect. They were the ones who pushed and stressed following the law to the letter of the law. Okay, and you can see the difference there too, and also in their beliefs. One of the things you have to notice, though, at the end, when the destruction of Jerusalem happened in 70 AD, the Sadducees completely ceased to exist. And the reason being is, when they destroyed Jerusalem, the Sadducees were political affiliates of Rome, and Rome got rid of them. Now, the Pharisees lasted a little longer than 70 AD, but not much longer. And the reason they didn't last much longer is because by the time they got done with all the destruction of Jerusalem, all the destruction of Judea, Rome had wiped out 97% of the Jewish people. So there wasn't many of them left. Now today, they don't have a Pharisee, quote unquote, group. You can refer to someone as a Pharisee because of the way they think, the way they act. They don't have a quote unquote group. There is groups that they consider to be Pharisaical, like the rabbinic Jews. They basically want to follow the law more strictly, but they're not Pharisees in modern world. The Pharisees and Sadducees no longer exist. So we have those two groups we're not familiar with. The Pharisees, they honestly believe, like I said, that Jesus violated the law of Moses by doing things like performing miracles on the Sabbath and by freely associating with people they viewed as sinners, including tax collectors, prostitutes, and the people that work for the government, and anybody that worked for the Roman government. The Sadducees, like I said, maintained their position of power by accommodating the Romans. When Rome was in power, they represented basically like a mediator between Rome and the people. They just wanted to keep the peace. Because if they kept the peace, that means they kept power and they kept money. If they didn't keep the peace, Rome wiped them out. And in 70 AD, that's what Rome did. Now, we also see two other things come about, two specific names, and they are Sadducees. And they are the only time that two Sadducees are named in the whole Bible. And the two names of the Sadducees are Annas and his son-in-law Caiaphas, and they're both high priests. Annas was a high priest from 6 to 15 AD, and Rome forced him out. They didn't kill him, they just took his position away and gave it to Caiaphas. And when Caiaphas took power, it kind of upset the Jewish people because that's not the way God instituted the high priest. The high priest was supposed to be passed down from your lineage. You had a lifetime appointment as high priest. When you died, your heir took over. Just like Aaron, when he died, his sons took over. And Samuel, when Eli died, his sons were supposed to take over, but God killed them first because they were so bad. And then Eli died. So you have a high priest who is supposed to have sons take over. But the Roman government kind of violated that law. So the people did not like Caiaphas and did not respect him. That's why you have a lot of times when you're reading the Gospels, you're going to see them say Annas, the high priest, or Caiaphas, the high priest. That's why it looks like you have two high priests. That's why in the trial of Jesus, when they take him to the high priest's house, it's to Annas' high priest. Because some people respected Annas more than they did Caiaphas. So you see all that. Now, these two parties, they made up what was called the Sanhedrin Council, or the Jewish High Court. And they were made up of 35 Pharisees and 35 Sadducees, and then that high priest oversaw them and made the deciding vote on things. Kind of like our Senate today. You know, you have we don't have an exact number of Pharisees or Republicans and Democrats, but it's 50-50, and then the vice president or Speaker of the House makes the deciding vote. So now let's talk about another person that came about and we don't know anything about, and that was the king who Jesus was born under. And you notice I'm not talking about all the stuff that was in the reading, because the reading was all about the genealogy. And we all know that all these genealogies, and if you've done your questions, they had you probably read them and you could go through all those genealogies. But this is when Jesus is born, this is what's going on. This is the background. So the king his name is Herod the Great, and his reign was from 37 to about 4 BC. Now he's known as Herod the Great not because he was such a good king. We actually know he's not a good king. What are some of the things that Herod did wasn't good? Right. He tried to kill all the children under 2 years old. What else did he do? Well, he probably did tax them, but it's not mentioned in the Gospels. But one of the things he did was try to trick the Magi to get them to bring Jesus to him or tell him where he's at. Okay, so he wasn't a very good person. That's not why they call him Herod the Great. He was great because they call him Herod the Great because of his ambitious building projects. He was huge into building. That's why you hear it called Herod's Temple now. The temple of God is often referred to as Herod's Temple during this time because he expounded on it and he built upon it and made it huge. When Herod got finished with it, that's when the temple is at, and the grounds of the temple is at its height of all time. And that's what you see today when you see the outline of the temple. And when you look at and this right here is just an image of the corner. This is the southwest corner, an artist drawing. And I got this from the Carta Jerusalem Atlas. And it talks about it. It says, this reconstruction of the southwest corner of the Temple Mount depicts the magnificence of the building on the Temple Mount after the end of Herod's construction projects. You can see how much bigger he made it. He added that big, tall structure and expanded the mount. He made it more opulent. He made it more beautiful. He took the brass and added it to the gates. I know we talked about the brass and stuff in the gates in Revelation. When you walked over the hill into Jerusalem to see it, it shined. And that's because of Herod. Okay, the temple before this was barely, when they rebuilt it in Ezra's day, was not very good. They did do the best they could, but it was nothing like this. He took it back to what Solomon had done and it then expounded upon it. And then he also done all kinds of other building projects, not just the temple. So he was a very good king as far as that goes. Despite his numerous shortcomings, Herod influenced that time and that culture in the Gospels in ways a lot of people don't give him credit for. Most of us only think of him as that evil king, as the one who tried to kill all the babies, as the one who tried to trick the Magi in the nativity story. And he is that person. But he's also a major influence on the world we find ourselves studying. He was a visionary leader who turned Palestine, that area, into one of the most affluent areas in all of the world at that time. It was only rivaled by Rome at that time. He enhanced trade routes and he developed a wealthy economy. Not to say he was not a harsh king and that the Jews liked him. They did not like him. They hated him, as a matter of fact. He was harsh, but he got things done. And he did things that helped put a time when Jesus was just right. Everything he did made it perfect for the right time for Jesus. Was it always good? No, but it worked out for the good. In fact, the reason a lot of the Jews hated him was the fact that he wasn't even a Jewish person, even though he claimed to be king of the Jews. His lineage was Edomite. And do you know what Edomites are? Who Edomites were? No, Edom. You have Edom, who was their father was, or their main, how do I say it? Main forefather was Esau. And Esau was Jacob's brother. And from all throughout the Old Testament, Jacob and Esau, Israel and Edom hated each other. So here you have Esau basically ruling Israel. So that's why they hated him. He was an Edomite. But then he dies. Right before he dies, he changes his will. And instead of naming just one single heir like a king would do, he takes and basically splits up his territory into four. And his four sons. And that's where you get all the other Herods from. It gets confusing with all the Herods in the Bible, doesn't it? In the New Testament. You have 3 or 4 different Herods. And shortly after Herod the Great is the king when Jesus is born, but he dies shortly after that. So Jesus wasn't even back from Egypt when Herod the Great dies. That's why Joseph returns. Remember in the story, the angel tells him he's dead, he can return. But he is afraid of who? His son, the other Herod. So he goes to Nazareth. So you have all kinds of different Herods. So Herod the Great is when he's first born. Then his 4 sons become known what is called tetrarchs. Now, tetrarchs is just a fancy title, and it literally means 4. It's a Greek word that means 4. That's all it is. And they were basically just rulers of territories. They weren't really kings. They were tetrarchs. Rome never actually gave them the power that King Herod the Great had. So his 4 sons become that. You had Herod Antipas II. He was the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. This is the King Herod who executes John the Baptist. And this is the same one that Jesus calls a fox. And he is the same one that he is brought to for trial. So that's when you see this in the story, you'll know who it is. Herod Philip, he is mentioned, but he's always mentioned with his brother Antipas, and he doesn't do much. He was in the northern territories, and he basically had a peaceful rule. No one ever bothered him. Rome never bothered him. He's not really mentioned in the other than just by name in the Gospels. Herod Agrippa I, he wasn't technically King Herod's son. He was his grandson. But after his son, and I don't even want to try to pronounce that name, died, he was made heir in his place. And we don't see him in the Gospels, but we do see him somewhere else. We just got done studying it. It's in Acts. He's the Herod that comes out with the shiny robe, and it claims to be like a god, and then God strikes him dead, and he's eaten by worms. He's also the Herod that martyrs James the apostle. Now, here's the thing. All these Herods played parts in the Gospels and Acts, and they show up throughout. But here's the one that played the biggest part because he doesn't really have a big name in it. Herod Archelaus, he only reigned for 2 years in Judea, in Jerusalem. And Caesar Augustus replaced him. For whatever reason, I don't know for sure. But what's important is the person he replaced him with. He replaced him with Pontius Pilate. So that's how we get Pontius Pilate into the story. You have all these Herods, all these things going on. And Jesus will say it a great deal. All these kings he will interact with. All this stuff. And we have to understand who they are and how they play a part in it. Because if you don't realize who they are and how they play a part in it, you miss key facts. You miss key points of how we are supposed to interact with people in those positions. Because were these people honorable? Well, one of them was. He had a peaceful rule. Didn't really say much negative about him. Well, 3 of them weren't. One of them gets by worms. How are we supposed to interact with them? So you have all these different things going on. Now, let's talk about one last thing, and that's the language. And I'm not talking about Hebrew or Greek. I'm talking about the language that they use when speaking as far as topics, because it's spoken a lot about in the Gospels. And Jesus will say it a great deal, just as John the Baptist does too. And he says throughout his ministry, he uses the language in the form of phrases such as my kingdom, or my Father's kingdom, or the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven. Why would he want to use this type of language? Is it simply because he's talking about his kingdom? In a sense it is, but it's also because Jesus was claiming to be the Christ. And the Christ is just another word for Messiah. So when you see that word Christ, it literally means anointed one. And that's translated from the Hebrew word for Messiah. So you could say Jesus the anointed one, substitute that, Jesus the Messiah, Jesus Christ, however how you want to put it. It's the same thing. He is claiming to be that anointed one. And the reason he's claiming it that way is because in the first century, Jewish people commonly associate Messiah with the kingdom of David, with being the son of David. For instance, in 2 Chronicles 6:42, O Lord, do not turn away your face of your anointed one. Remember your steadfast love for David, your servant. whenever they thought of the Christ, whenever they thought of the Messiah, it was always in reference to David. Always in reference to his kingdom being reestablished. They were expecting the Messiah to come and replace all these other kingdoms in the world. They were expecting him to come in and set up a Jewish kingdom. Prior to Jesus' arrival, the Old Testament scriptures were being reinterpreted, okay, and incorrectly too, making them point toward the establishment of an earthly kingdom. That is motivated by two things. Patriotic pride. The Jewish people were proud to be Jewish. And they knew that they had been punished for a long time. And they knew the scriptures. And now it was their turn to be in control. And then two, prejudice. We talked a lot about this in Acts. They had been punished for a long time. They hated everybody around them, didn't they? They were prejudiced. The Jews felt that even though they had endured those four kingdoms that Daniel had prophesied about, that it was now their turn to be an empire. It was now their turn to do what the prophecy said, like in Daniel 2:44. And in those days, the kings, the God of heaven, will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. That's talking about destroying the four kingdoms they just went through. It was meant that God's kingdom, this Jewish kingdom, is how they were interpreted to be this earthly kingdom. Here's the problem. It never says that. It never says that this kingdom is going to be an earthly kingdom. And here's the problem. We can't judge them too harshly, can we? Because we do the same thing today. In our interpretations, a lot of times, of prophecies about the new heavens and the new earth, we interpret them to be physical earthly kingdoms. How many people believe there's going to be a new Jerusalem set up for 1,000 years? And Jesus is going to rule there for 1,000 years. We can't look at them too harshly. Nowhere in the Bible does it ever say that God's kingdom is ever going to be an earthly kingdom. In fact, Jesus says the exact opposite. In John 18:36, Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from this world." But that's the biggest reason they reject Jesus. They are expecting some big warrior king, and Jesus brings about different kingdoms. He brings about this different kingdom that's not even going to be on this earth. He brings about a spiritual kingdom, a heavenly kingdom. And they can't accept that because they've been waiting through 4 empires, and now they're ready to be in control. Christians today are the same way. We've been waiting for 2,000 years. We've seen persecution after persecution, and now we're ready to be in control. And I've been reading and studying a lot on this through Revelation stuff. Even our brotherhood, Alexander Campbell, believed that once the Christians were completely united, then Christ would return. Once the Christians were completely united and in control of the world, Christ would return. We still have that same issue today. We can't think of the kingdom of God as an earthly kingdom. When he came, he established his kingdom for all time. Yes, the kingdom is the church, and we are here today, but is our kingdom here on earth? Is our kingdom limited to just America, or just England, or just China, or just whatever country you're living in? Do we have borders? No. Our kingdom is a spiritual kingdom. We have no borders. Our kingdom is in heaven. It will always be there. You look through Hebrews, it talks about the new heavens, new earth, new Jerusalem, the same as way Revelation does in chapter 12. it's a spiritual kingdom. He's pointing to that. They missed that point. He's trying to teach them, you're missing the point. You're missing the kingdom. I'm sitting right here in front of you. I am the king, and you're missing me. I am the Christ, and you're missing me. I'm giving you a chance to be in this kingdom, and you're missing me. And that kingdom language goes throughout all the Gospels. And that kingdom language is so important, and it's such an important concept that it is discussed over 100 times in the Gospels. And it's discussed over 20 times in the book of Acts. And that is what's all important about the context of the Gospels. It's about who shaped it, the time that it came about, and why things were the way they were then, and the language and what Jesus was trying to do and show, and who, why. It was the perfect time for it. It's why he came when he did. And when we look at that in the whole, and not in just one little section at a time, when we look at it as the whole, we see and we can understand what Paul was writing about in Galatians 4:4-5. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. That is the gospel context. That is what we start with when we start looking at those genealogies. That's the beginning of the story. And the story just gets better and grows. But we have to understand where that story starts at. Any questions or comments?